Imagine this. A smug HOA president sets fire to a farmer's old corn barn, thinking she's above the law. But what she didn't realize was that the quiet man she was targeting wasn't just a simple landowner. He was one of the most feared federal judges in the country, with the power to destroy her entire empire with a stroke of his pen. What follows is a clash of arrogance versus justice, with secrets, revenge, and a shocking reckoning no one in that neighborhood could have ever predicted. Before we get into this insane story of HOA corruption, arrogance, and ultimate downfall, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another viral HOA drama. And don't forget to drop a like if you enjoy seeing arrogant Karens finally get what they deserve, because trust me, this story is one for the books. It all started in a quiet suburban community that had been carefully manicured and tightly controlled by an aggressive homeowners association. At the center of this HOA was a woman named Deborah, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood who had quickly become known as a Karen of the highest order. She carried herself with an air of superiority, policing lawns, barking at children, and fining residents for the most trivial of infractions. For years she had ruled unchecked, believing no one could stand against her power. But her latest target was a man she thought was an easy victim, an older resident named Thomas. Thomas had recently moved into the community after spending most of his life away from the spotlight. He owned a large plot of land on the edge of the HOA boundary, with an old corn barn sitting proudly at the back. While the barn was historic and meaningful to him, Deborah saw it as an eyesore, a blot on the perfect image of her community. From the moment she laid eyes on it, she declared war. At first, her tactics were the usual, threatening letters, bogus HOA fines, and snide remarks in community meetings. Thomas, however, never flinched. He paid no attention to her threats, quietly maintaining his property without responding to her escalating aggression. This infuriated Deborah. She thrived on control and on seeing people bend to her will. Yet this man, with his calm silence, stood as an immovable wall against her power. As weeks passed, her frustration boiled into obsession. She convinced the HOA board to join her crusade, fabricating claims about the barn being unsafe, a fire hazard, and even a breeding ground for pests. None of it was true, but Deborah was never concerned with truth. She wanted dominance, and she would not rest until she had forced Thomas to his knees. Then came the night everything changed. Under the cover of darkness, emboldened by her belief that she was untouchable, Deborah took matters into her own hands. With a gasoline canister in one hand and a box of matches in the other, she crept toward Thomas's barn. The dry wood caught quickly, and within minutes the structure was engulfed in flames. The barn, which had stood for generations, was reduced to ash as Deborah stood in the shadows, smiling at her work. She thought she had won. But what Deborah didn't know was that the quiet man she had targeted was far from ordinary. Thomas was no helpless victim. He was a federal judge, known in the legal world as the Hammer for his ruthless sentencing and unflinching pursuit of justice. His retirement in this community was supposed to be his escape from the chaos of his career. But now Deborah had dragged him back into a war, and this time the battlefield was personal. The fire smoldered through the night, and by morning the neighborhood buzzed with shock. Deborah feigned innocence, gasping and pretending to be horrified at the tragedy. Yet Thomas remained silent. He surveyed the charred remains with a cold, unreadable expression. The neighbors whispered, speculating that this might be the one thing to finally break the old man's spirit. But they were wrong. Because while Deborah believed she had destroyed him, in truth she had awakened a sleeping giant. This was no longer about a barn. This was about justice, power, and a reckoning that would shake the HOA to its core. And Thomas was only just beginning to prepare for what came next. The days after the fire were tense, filled with speculation and whispered gossip across the community. Deborah, smug and satisfied, assumed that Thomas would crumble under the loss. She continued her charade, even publicly offering sympathy while secretly reveling in what she had done. But Thomas wasn't grieving. He was planning. In the privacy of his home, he gathered files, case histories, and evidence. Over the years, he had built a career unraveling criminal enterprises and exposing corruption at the highest levels of government. To dismantle a petty tyrant like Deborah and her HOA board would be child's play. He knew her arrogance had left trails, fraudulent fines, misused HOA funds, and perhaps even connections with shady contractors she had funneled money to. All he needed was patience, and the HOA would unravel itself. The first cracks began to show quickly. Homeowners, already frustrated by Deborah's constant interference, started to push back. They noticed discrepancies in their dues, projects that had been promised but never completed, and strange fees that seemed to benefit Deborah more than anyone else. Whispers of corruption spread, and Thomas carefully encouraged them without ever revealing his true hand. Meanwhile, Deborah's obsession grew darker. She saw Thomas's silence not as a sign of strength, but as a refusal to acknowledge her victory. She doubled down on harassment, issuing new fines, filing bogus complaints with the county, and even trying to push for Thomas's expulsion from the community. But every attempt seemed to bounce off him, and in her frustration, she only exposed herself further. Behind the scenes, Thomas was building a meticulous case. He collected bank records, photographed suspicious activity, and contacted old colleagues who still respected his influence in the legal system. Every move Deborah made added fuel to the fire he was quietly stoking against her. And then came the turning point, a private meeting of the HOA board, where Deborah attempted to secure approval for a massive landscaping project that funneled nearly all the funds into a company owned by her cousin. Thomas obtained the documents. He now had concrete evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. The judge within him stirred awake, and with it came the cold, unrelenting force that had once sent powerful criminals to prison. Deborah had no idea she had already lost. While she continued parading around the community, mocking Thomas's burnt barn as an improvement to the neighborhood, Thomas was quietly pulling strings. One call, one sealed envelope, and the walls of Deborah's empire began to tremble. But this was only the beginning. For Thomas, true justice required patience. He wasn't simply going to expose her. He was going to dismantle her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ashes, just like his barn. The storm broke with a federal investigation. Residents woke to news vans at the gates, reporters swarming for answers as subpoenas were delivered to Deborah and the HOA board. The allegations were staggering: embezzlement of homeowner dues, tax evasion, fraudulent contracts, and criminal conspiracy. The community was in shock, but Thomas remained calm, as if he had seen this all before. Deborah, on the other hand, was unraveling. The woman who had once strutted with arrogance now screamed at reporters, denying everything while throwing her fellow board members under the bus. The pressure mounted, and soon board members began to turn on her. Faced with jail time, they spilled secrets about hidden bank accounts, falsified meeting notes, and Deborah's direct role in orchestrating everything. The net was closing. Behind the scenes, Thomas's influence was undeniable. Federal prosecutors, aware of his reputation, pursued the case with zeal. Judges and investigators who once worked alongside him made sure the process was airtight. Deborah was trapped in a cage of her own making with no escape. But for Thomas, this was not just about seeing her punished. It was about restoring balance to a community that had suffered under her tyranny. He ensured that every homeowner's stolen money was traced and accounted for, that every fraudulent fee was exposed, and that the HOA itself was restructured under new leadership. The neighbors, who had once pitied him after the fire, now looked at him with awe. The quiet man they had underestimated had turned out to be a giant among them. And Deborah, the once untouchable Karen, was led away in handcuffs, her empire reduced to rubble. Yet even as justice was served, Thomas stood before the smoldering remains of his barn and felt no triumph. This had never been about revenge. It was about showing that arrogance and corruption, no matter how small or petty, could never escape accountability. As the sun set behind him, the neighborhood was forever changed. The barn was gone, Deborah's reign was over, and peace returned to the community. But those who knew Thomas understood one thing. He hadn't chosen this fight, but once forced into it, he ensured it ended with absolute justice. And in that, his reputation as a feared federal judge was not just a relic of the past, but a living reminder of what true power looked like. And that's how a smug HOA president's arrogance backfired in the most spectacular way possible. If you enjoyed this story and love seeing Karens finally meet justice, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more insane HOA drama, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another tale of arrogance meeting its downfall.